I decided that it'd be good to interview both my pastor and his wife. I was hoping originally that my wife would be able to join us. Unfortunately, because of her job, she couldn't. So I tried to incorporate some of the questions that I thought maybe she would want to ask a pastor's wife as well. When we met at one of my favorite hamburger places in Helotes, which is an outskirt of San Antonio called Bobby J's. Place wasn't a very fancy restaurant. There's when you drive up, there's a giant sign of the picture of the gentleman who started the company, and it overlooked just a very small, plain-looking brick building. Inside, it had the normal country theme, um, and it was there that I met Pastor Mike and his wife. And his technical term, or is spiritual growth pastor. The first question I asked him was more of a generalized question. How did they first meet? He tells me that they had first met in college during a small retreat. Beth made sure that they both got on the same bus on this way to the retreat. So she already kind of had an idea that she wanted to get to know Mike a little bit better. They're around 19 and 18 when they first met. They were both attending a Baptist university in Abilene, Texas. Pastor Mike started attending the college there, the university, with the idea of becoming a choral director. A lot of the songs that he did were in Latin and in German, but they all centered around the theme of Christ. And he thought at the time, instead of becoming a pastor, which wasn't even on his radar at the time, that he could use his music to help influence and teach about Christ. It was after about 2 years at the university that he eventually changed his major to religious education, or at least he was planning on changing it to religious education. Instead, he messed up a little bit on the paperwork, and instead of getting a Bachelor of Arts degree, he wound up getting a Bachelor of Science degree. So he got a degree more into biblical ministry, kind of like what I'm doing right now. It was during those first couple of years of college, and about 2 years after meeting Beth, that it was then when he kind of felt the calling to go into the ministry. And the way it happened was he was working at a church in his hometown, and a lot of different ministry opportunities kept coming up. He went to school that next year, right after that summer spending there, and officially then changed his degree. Beth, on the other hand, went to college. Before she actually went to college, she had already surrendered her life to God to be in some form of ministry. She didn't know how. During that time, there wasn't a lot of opportunities for women in the ministry, so she felt that she'd probably end up doing something in the way of missionary work. When their relationship began to get a little more serious, it was around the same time that Pastor Mike, when he came back from that summer, changed his degree, that Beth had realized that, in her words, it was then that I realized God was calling us to be together. And it wasn't just for them to be together as a couple, but them to be together as a couple and serve God together. I asked them if there was ever any real tension between them when it came to making the decisions and following that decision. They both agreed that because it was always about them together serving God and never about them individually, there really wasn't much tension or disagreement. The only time that there was a little hesitation was when they felt the call to move to Brownsville. Beth wasn't real excited about that. Out of all the places she could pick in the world, that probably wasn't her first. It's a much more Hispanic culture there, and not knowing any Spanish, it was quite a culture shock. And they ended up living there from 83 all the way to 2005. After 2 years of being there, Pastor Mike had took a job with his minor to teach music. And then eventually, after 2 years of doing that, the church asked him if he'd be a part-time youth pastor. The full-time youth pastor had taken, and at first he kind of didn't really want to do this. So he prayed and asked God to change his heart, that if this was something that God wanted him to do, that God would change his heart. And eventually God did, and he went full-time. The pastor had been there since 81 and helped train Mike to grow and in his skills, and had become more of a mentor. And to this day, after 30 years, is still a mentor to him, and they still have a great relationship. The conversation kind of then transitioned a little bit from how they became a couple to how he got into the ministry, to more about what it's like to be a minister for him now. When asked what an average week looked like, Mike responded by saying that he primarily works from home. You see, the church that we attend to right now started out as kind of small, and we're eventually growing, but there's really only one office. So a lot of his time is spent at home, working from home. So work there on Tuesday. He had worked there on Tuesdays and Wednesdays, and Thursday afternoons. Mondays they have staff meetings. He leads a life group on Tuesday nights and meets with people individually, kind of like he did with me, on Tuesdays and sometimes on Thursdays. Tuesday nights he has a special men's group that he meets with. Beth has vocal rehearsals during that same time, so they're both doing something separate with the church. Wednesdays is when the actual office personnel all meet together at the church. A large amount of the correspondence that he does, since he doesn't have an official office, is done through email. Thursday is when the entire staff and all the volunteers come together and they discuss what Sunday they're going to do or what stuff needs to be done with the church. It's a time when everybody can come together and kind of get on the same page. Friday is his final day off. And the way he likes to spend his days off, when he can, he's an amazing photographer. So he's had stuff put in different magazines. He's had calendars made out some work, but kind of like Hansen did with his fly fishing. He'll go out into the country and he'll take pictures, but he'll spend that time also alone with God. Some of the challenges as a ministry couple came from the time when they had young children. Pastor Mike would be gone a lot. This was the time when he is just starting to learn how to become a pastor. And this would leave Beth alone with the kids, all 5 kids. If they could go back and change anything, Beth said, and Mike agreed, it would be to spend more time together with the kids. Because of this, he tries to make sure that anyone that's on the staff doesn't spend more than 3 or 4 nights away from their family. They believe that it's extremely important to spend as much time together as family as possible. One thing she learned from being a pastor's wife, that helped mentor, that Mike's mentor's wife had taught her, was that there are sometimes expectations to do certain things. She said, you're in the ministry, but your first ministry is to your husband and to your children. You can't let other people determine what your ministry is. God called you into ministry, and it's up to Him to make that determination. Looking through my notes, I remembered Hansen talking about every pastor goes through a time when they just want to give up. I asked Pastor Mike if he ever felt like that. With a slight laugh, he goes, how many times? sometimes he said it's more about not feeling effective or maybe need to be somewhere else. Sometimes it may not be quitting altogether, but it's more about maybe there's a project that you're working on that just feel like giving up on. When tough times comes, they will. And he says, you'll always have to go back to the call. There are going to be rough times, difficult times. When you look what the people in scriptures went through, he says that I haven't come close to any of that type of stuff. In the end, what's important is that it always comes back to the call. I ended the interview with a question for both Mike and Beth. If you could give one piece of advice to a person starting the path of becoming pastor, and one piece of advice for the wife of that person, what would it be? Now, Mike sat and thought for a second, and he said, spend every day with Jesus. Submit to him and spend the time with him. And when I asked Beth the same question, what she would give, any question, like if my wife Candace asked her for a piece of advice, what would she tell her? And she said, trust Jesus. Put your trust in him. You'll be asked to go and do things that you'd never think you would be possible. You just need to trust that he will provide, and be willing to trust your husband. That through God, that God will be working through him. And if you didn't figure out that picture, where is it? Right there. That's a picture of Pastor Mike and his wife, Beth. Thank you.